A screaming comes across the sky. It has happened before, but there is nothing to compare it to now. So begins Thomas Pynchon's 1973 Gravity's Rainbow, one of the most iconic first lines in all of 20th century literature, which opens a postmodern masterpiece widely considered to be the most difficult, dense and, dare I say, even impenetrable works of literature of all time. But we can and we will penetrate to the core of this masterpiece, and we will discover together what makes it such a resonant and influential work. When a great work of literature is called impenetrable or unreadable, that's typically a sign that the work is inexhaustible. And that's a different thing, and inexhaustibility is a marker of great literature. Can you come to the end of the work? Is there always more to explore, no matter how many times you reread it? Is there always more to think about? With an inexhaustible work of literature, you might find that you struggle to articulate exactly why specific passages, themes, or events in the work move you so intensely. You may find that you struggle to put your reaction into words. Gravity's Rainbow is an inexhaustible work that we must relentlessly engage with over the course of our lives if we have any hope of approaching its greatness. Why read Gravity's Rainbow? Well, aside from the fact that this novel offers us an enormous cognitive challenge, indeed it's one of the most difficult books that I've personally ever read. It's in the top 3 for me. Aside from the fact that it's good for us to read cognitively challenging books, it's good for us to engage with works that are over our heads, because then it forces us to grow. Aside from that, Gravity's Rainbow is also incredibly funny. Riotously funny. It is incredibly profound, but it also doesn't take itself too seriously. And there are parts of the book that are astonishingly and breathtakingly beautiful. There are also parts of the book that are lewd and grotesque and disturbing, but essentially this book offers us, or attempts to offer us, all of life in the 20th century and the human condition. And it's an incredibly important work. Theodor Adorno said that it would be barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, and that was the sentiment in the culture coming off the back of the Second World War. Many wondered, is it possible to pen great literature again after the atrocities of the 20th century? And Thomas Pynchon proved that it was possible, and he gave us what we might call the first masterpiece of the postmodern era, and he channeled his poetic impulse into the novel form and gifted us one of the most resonant and informative works of the 20th century. And today, as we are now kicking off a deep read-through and lecture series for Gravity's Rainbow at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, which is at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Because we're kicking off a series that aims to explicate the work and not only make it understandable and accessible, but also make this a novel that you appreciate and perhaps even fall madly in love with. Because we're kicking off that lecture series today, let's talk about how to read Gravity's Rainbow. If there was any book in need of a how to read, then it's definitely this one. This is also a work that requires community, and it requires engagement and collaboration between readers. It requires us to crowdsource the meaning, and Pynchon believed that the readers were the ones doing most of the work, or the responsibility for uncovering the meaning lied with us. And this is something that we'll return to later in the video, but essentially one of the really exciting things about reading Pynchon is the fact that there is a community of readers. Difficulty creates community, and ever since this work was published, readers have been banding together to explicate the meaning in Gravity's Rainbow. So let's talk about how to read Gravity's Rainbow. Now, Pynchon's original title for Gravity's Rainbow was actually Mindless Pleasures, but this book actually presents us with very difficult pleasures. Yes, there are mindless pleasures to be had in the book as well. It is filled with slapstick humour, satire, irony, pastiche, madcap antics, lewd songs, and grotesque sexual episodes. There's most certainly a lot of fun to be had in reading Gravity's Rainbow, but its difficulty presents a barrier and an obstacle, and we must begin our discussion by talking about the difficulty of Gravity's Rainbow, its difficult nature. Now, I personally believe that a lot of the difficulty of Gravity's Rainbow can be dispatched with once one knows something of the story and the characters. The biggest hindrance to a reader's appreciation of this work is not knowing what's going on. Many readers will give the first couple of pages a go and they'll come to the conclusion that this is unreadable, I don't even know what's going on, and they will abandon it. And that's why it's absolutely necessary to have a guide with this book, because the majority response, the overwhelmingly common response, is abandoning the work, and certainly most people who pick up Gravity's Rainbow will never finish it, which is a shame, because honestly I think a lot of the difficulty in this book is front-loaded. Yeah, once you get past the first part, once you read the first 50 to 100 pages, once you have your bearings, it becomes incredibly fun. It becomes a really fun journey. Now, we've combated difficulty before in our reading. It's just that postmodernism offers a different breed of difficulty, and we'll talk about postmodernism in a moment, but let's take an example from another realm of difficult literature. Let's say Shakespeare. If you have ever embarked on a project that involves reading Shakespeare, if you've ever brought yourself to the Bard's works, you'll find that there are obstacles and hindrances in the fact that Shakespeare utilises now archaic, antiquated lexis and frames of references, and the poetic inversions are difficult to deal with. And so what you should do when coming to Shakespeare, and this is the same for opera too, is you should go and see a show. Yeah, you should go book in, and before you go to the show, look up a summary, a quick synopsis, just a very quick read through of what the story's about and who the central characters are. And once you have that in your head, you can dispatch momentarily with the guides and you can immerse yourself, and a lot of the meaning will reveal itself. It will arise from your immersion. So what I'm going to do is very reductively outline the story, and I say reductively because this is a sprawling novel and it is very, very difficult to reduce it down, but it's absolutely necessary for readers coming to the book for the first time. I will also be staying away from spoilers, and yes, I believe that you can spoil this book. It's certainly true that each new revelation, each new piece of the puzzle brings only more confusion, but we still also want to stay away from the surprises in the text because there are plenty of them. We will of course explain everything as we go through at the Hardcore Literature Book Club read through. It's very common to hear readers who've tackled Gravity's Rainbow say, well, it's about absolutely everything, so I can't really tell you what it's about. And I can understand that response, and there's a lot of truth in it because the work is all-encompassing and it's monumental. Gravity's Rainbow is what is referred to as an encyclopaedic novel. Yeah, Herman Melville's Moby Dick is another example of an encyclopaedic novel. This is a novel that offers a grand vision of the world and the human condition. But there is a backbone and there is a storyline that can be related very swiftly and reductively. And you might find the story to be rather shocking and not what you expect. So, what is Gravity's Rainbow about? Gravity's Rainbow is set primarily in Europe towards the end of the Second World War, and the book centres around the design, production and development of the V2 rocket by the German military. The V2 missile is the iconic weapon right at the centre of the narrative and almost becomes a protagonist in its own right. The V2 rockets, which were known as Hitler's revenge weapons, used to terrorise Britain, were unlike anything seen before. The V2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It would fly up to the edge of space and then it would descend at supersonic speeds. The V2 was also incredibly foundational when it came to other weapons, like the first missile to carry a nuclear warhead. V2 rockets were first launched against England in September of 1944, and over the course of just a few months, almost 1,000 6,400 struck the city of London. Now, the rocket used previously was the V1 rocket, which killed more than 6,000 people and left more than 18,000 people wounded and homeless. The V1 rocket was the more accurate projectile. The V2 rocket wasn't accurate, and its landings were pretty much randomized. But the power of the V2 rocket was in the fact that it travelled faster than the speed of sound, and this is very important. That meant there was no warning noise before it hit, and the V2 rockets were basically impossible to defend against. Early on in Gravity's Rainbow, we get this very chilling meditation from a character called Pirate Prentice. The first news you get of it is the blast. Then, if you're still around, you hear the sound of it coming in. So if you hear the sound of the V2, it means it's hit someone else, and they likely haven't survived it. If you're at the centre of the impact for the V2 rocket, you're not going to hear a thing, you are just going to die. You're going to be alive one moment, dead the next. By the time of the deployment of the V2 rockets, terror had become a part of daily life for British citizens. Now, if you've spoken to someone who lived through the Blitz, as I've been fortunate to do, you'll know all about the doodle bugs, or the buzz bombs. That's what they called the V1 rocket, which you could hear. So the V2 was silent, but the first projectile, the V1, you could hear it. And it made a distant humming noise that would become a booming roar, followed by deafening silence. Personal stories from this time, anecdotes from the Blitz, are very, very sobering. Essentially, you'd hear it buzz overhead, making its distinctive noise, and everyone would hold their breath. And then you would let out a sigh, a collective sigh, when you realised that some other poor sod had gotten it. And then you would just go on with your daily life. I'm sure we've all seen pictures of milkmen and bus drivers and office workers doing their normal day, going to work through the rubble in the aftermath of a night of bombing. Interestingly, one dance hall used to even time their music to the sound of the bombs dropping outside, to make the bombs part of the rhythm. Essentially, stiff upper lip was the attitude, and gallows humour, dark humour, became a necessary coping mechanism in order to continue living in the face of destruction. Now, British citizens got used to the V1, but the shift to the V2 was terrifying because it was just randomised obliteration, raining from the sky, without warning and without ability to defend. Here's protagonist Tyrone Slothrop from Gravity's Rainbow. And by the way, get used to some wacky names as you read this book. Roger Mexico and Jessica Swanlake are two of my favourite names in this book. Here is Tyrone Slothrop meditating on the frightening shift from the V1 to the V2. Once upon a time, Slothrop cared. No kidding. He thinks he did anyway. A lot of stuff prior to 1944 is getting blurry now. He can remember the first Blitz only as a long spell of good luck. Nothing that the Luftwaffe dropped came near him. But this last summer, they started in with those buzz bombs. You'd be walking on the street, in bed, just dozing off suddenly. Here comes this farting sound over the rooftops. If it just keeps on, rising to a peak and passing over, why, that's fine. Then it's somebody else's worry. But if the engine cuts off, look out, Jackson! It's begun its dive, sloshing the fuel aft, away from the engine burner, and you've got 10 seconds to get under something. Well, it wasn't really too bad. After a while, you adjusted, found yourself making small bets, a shilling or two, with Tantivy Muckamaffick at the next desk about where the next doodle would hit. But then last September, the rockets came. Them fucking rockets. You couldn't adjust to the bastards. No way. For the first time, he was surprised to find that he was really scared. Began drinking heavier, sleeping less, chain smoking, feeling in some way he'd been taken for a sucker. Christ, it wasn't supposed to keep on like this. Really chilling stuff. Now, although the V2 rocket sits at the centre of gravity's rainbow, it's atomic fear. Fear of the atomic bomb or the cosmic bomb, the phrase that Pynchon uses. It's atomic fear that pervades the text. Pynchon wrote this book at a time when Cold War anxieties were at their peak. And indeed, the Vietnam War was at the centre of public debate and Pynchon was vehemently against it. Pynchon was writing this book for about a decade, and we can see that 11 years prior to publication in 1962, we see the Cuban Missile Crisis. Around this time, fear of nuclear holocaust and total extinction was everywhere in American life. The question of the era was, are we on the brink of total destruction? You can turn to comic books from the era and you can see this anxiety about nuclear destruction absolutely everywhere, reflecting the contemporary concerns. And indeed, Pynchon himself draws from the comic book world the power of comic books in Gravity's Rainbow. But you can see that in all of our favourite comic books, pretty much everything is atomic. Yeah, the superheroes get their powers from an atomic blast or from radiation. This existential angst around nuclear destruction is there because everyone had seen what happened to Japan. Everyone had seen the total destruction that had unfolded when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, if you look to the epigraph that opens part 1 of Gravity's Rainbow, the novel is split into 4 parts, you get this quote that is a key to unlocking the thematic concerns of the novel. The quote goes like this: "Nature does not know extinction. All it knows is transformation. Everything science has taught me, and continues to teach me, strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual existence after death." This quote is attributed to Werner Von Braun. Now, Von Braun was the German rocket engineer behind the V2 rocket, and this was a rocket that 60,000 prisoners of war from concentration camps had worked on and died building. Werner von Braun wrote these words in the early 60s. He surrendered to US forces in May of 1945, and he was transferred to a leadership position working at NASA, designing the rocket that landed on the moon in 1969. So America has one of Hitler's top Nazi engineers to thank for closing the gap on the space race. The V2s were ultimately incredibly expensive to produce, and they consumed enormous resources that desperately needed allocating elsewhere during the war. And thanks to espionage and a lot of secret operations designed in pushing the deployment of the V2 back, thanks to all of this, whilst the V2 rockets were devastating, they came too late in the conflict to make a significant impact. But this weaponry would ultimately herald the dawn of the space age. Pynchon, by going back to the end of the Second World War and exploring the development of the V2 rocket, was able to work through contemporary concerns, war anxieties and existential crisis. The conflicts may change. We might speak of cycles of conflict, the cyclical nature of war, but ultimately that anxiety of destruction and death is always there. Are we not simply just living through an extension of the previous conflict? It's just transformed, it's just morphed, and it's just become an ostensibly different conflict, but ultimately it's all pretty much the same. Now, Gravity's Rainbow feels like paranoia in book form. Paranoia and fear of conspiracy steams off its pages. And one of the most profound ideas that Pynchon prompts us to consider is the idea that the true instigators and the true operators of conflicts, the ones who keep conflicts going, these are actually global corporations, institutions, a hidden elite. Gravity's Rainbow is paranoia in book form, and the paranoia is concerning them with a capital T, or they with a capital T. They who have a lot to gain from ongoing conflict. We all know this and intuit this though, don't we? We know that there are capitalistic incentives when it comes to contributing to the war machine. We get this idea in Gravity's Rainbow that the war was not political, but technological, and catering to the hunger for power of a ruling elite. The paranoia that comes through Gravity's Rainbow concerns the degree to which an international conspiracy of industrial cartels control or determine our destiny. And here's a great quote from Gravity's Rainbow that speaks to that. This war was never political at all. The politics was all theatre, all just to keep the people distracted. Secretly, it was being dictated instead by the needs of technology, by a conspiracy between human beings and techniques, by something that needed the energy burst of war, crying, "Money be damned, the very life of insert name of nation is at stake," but meaning most likely, dawn is nearly here. I need my night's blood, my funding, more. Now, of course, this all sounds like paranoia, and that's the point. And there's a wonderfully insightful essay by Pynchon critic Leo Bassani called Pynchon, Paranoia and Literature, in which he proposes the idea that Pynchon, the author, is not on our side as we're reading Gravity's Rainbow. So often we're used to our authors being on our side. We are used to being in cahoots with the writer who's telling us a story. But this isn't really the case with Pynchon the writer. Pynchon the writer becomes them, or they with a capital T. He is the reader's they. He is the hidden institution who controls the flow of information, and we are the ones seeking knowledge, seeking information, and trying to piece everything together as we work our way through the book. So when we read through this book, it feels very much like the paranoid questing that our ostensibly central protagonist, if we can call him that, must go through. Gravity's Rainbow is a sprawling work. It has a beginning, it has an end, and it has many middles, but it features over 400 characters. Most of these characters will only appear once, briefly, and many of the recurring characters will appear and then they'll disappear for long stretches of time. We have roughly 24 strong, distinct, individual personalities. So we have some really robust characters, and this can make it very difficult to get your bearings. Indeed, even without this novel using experimental avant-garde prose, a huge cast of characters is always going to be difficult. Even in straightforward realist narratives, if you have hundreds of characters, that is a real obstacle that we need to overcome. But it helps to know that we have roughly half a dozen major characters in the novel that we can call the central protagonists, which I think is a much more manageable number to deal with. Our central protagonist, again as far as we can use that designation, is US Army Lieutenant Tyrone Slothrop. Now, it really helps to isolate a backbone or a plot line running through the novel so you have something to hold on to. So here it is. The bizarre thing about Slothrop is that he becomes the subject of an extensive investigation when members of a clandestine military organisation realise that rockets are being dropped at the location where Slothrop last had a sexual liaison. There seems to be some connection between the rockets falling and Slothrop's erections. And the thing about this book is you will find yourself really trying to wrap your head around really difficult topics. If you talk about it with other people, you'll stutter and you'll have a false start, you'll go down a path and then you'll need to correct yourself and you'll talk in circles. It feels like moving through a labyrinth and it's very, very challenging. But as you're talking through these cognitively challenging ideas, you're also talking about a man's erections, and you catch yourself for a moment and say, wait a minute, what am I talking about? So the joke is kind of on us, and Pynchon is definitely having his fun. It's kind of ludicrous to be talking about these really difficult ideas and also talking about penises relentlessly. And a little warning for sensitive readers, we are given a relentless procession of grotesque and vividly detailed descriptions of sex. So I think the Pulitzer were right when they called this book obscene. The Pulitzer Prize refused to even entertain the idea of giving Pynchon a Pulitzer Prize because they said the book was turgid, unreadable and obscene. And you know what? They're not entirely wrong. There is a lot of truth to that. It's hard to argue against that when every few pages you encounter a phallus in some form. Okay, so the thing about Tyrone Slothrop is in his infancy, he was subjected to conditioning experiments by a German scientist called Laszlo Jamf. And this scientist would go on to create a plastic called Immopilex G, a plastic that was used in the V2 rocket. So there we go, we have a connection between Slothrop and the rocket there. Now these experiments sought to make a mystery stimulus cause Slothrop's arousal. And there really is some seriously messed up stuff in the history of psychology. Whilst this is a fictionalized account, a fiction of an experiment, a conditioning experiment, it's actually not far off from many of the studies, the psychological studies that were conducted in the 20th century. There are many studies committed in the 20th century that today would never have a hope in hell of passing an ethics committee. There's one famous study that Slothrop's history reminds me of, and that's the case of little Albert. This experiment was seen as evidence for classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning, named after Pavlov, and indeed a lot of the absurdist comedy in this book arises from our behavioural psychologist character, Edward W. Pointsman. The behavioural psychologists have this book that they revere as their holy text, and the book is a copy of Pavlov's lectures. Classical conditioning is where you pair a biological, physiological stimulus, like food, with a neutral stimulus, like ringing a bell. In Pavlov's iconic experiments, he paired food, introduction of food, with ringing a bell for dogs. And he found that eventually he could get dogs salivating just by ringing a bell and not showing them the food. So he classically conditioned them to salivate on cue. Now, in the little Albert experiment, this child was conditioned to fear a white lab rat because they paired the appearance of this rat with a loud noise. Albert would develop a fear response to the rat even without the noise, and he would also go on to show fear responses to other white furry things like a Santa beard. So the concern in the book is that Slothrop's erections could potentially be causing the rockets to fall, or perhaps they are a prediction, perhaps they're a divination of where the rockets will fall. Either way, Pavlovian psychologist Pointsman thinks that there is a direct causal relationship between Slothrop's arousal and the bombs dropping a few days later. In fact, they drop 2 to 10 days later. Whilst his associate, statsman Roger Mexico, thinks that the relationship is just random and coincidental. Now, to see a link between the rockets and Slothrop's erection requires a wrangling with the idea of reversing cause and effect. So, response precedes and prefaces stimulus, rather than stimulus-response. And whatever this stimulus is, there surely has to be a connection between the rocket and the arousal that we cannot see. Here's our Pavlovian behaviourist character. The stimulus somehow must be the rocket, some precursor wraith, some rocket stubble present for Slothrop in the percentage of smiles on a bus, menstrual cycles being operated upon in some mysterious way. Are there fluctuations in the sexual market, in pornography or prostitutes, perhaps tying into prices on the stock exchange itself, that we clean living lot know nothing about? Does news from the front affect the itch between their pretty thighs? Does desire grow directly or inversely as the real chance of sudden death? Damn it, What cue right in front of our eyes that we haven't the subtlety of heart to see? Leo Bassani talks of Slothrop responding to a climate of being, a rocketness that manifests itself in different ways, and his erectile response is just further manifestation of the rocket. And Thomas Schaub writes in Pynchon, The Voice of Ambiguity, the entire weight of gravity's rainbow calls the absoluteness of that idea, cause and effect, into question and moves both characters and readers into the uncertain ground between the distinctness of successive events and the timeless complementarities of meaning. We see that the way the narrative itself is presented really plays with the idea of reversing stimulus and response, cause and effect, because we get temporality shuffled about. So Slothrop's quest is to discover the degree to which his conditioning is bound up with the rocket. By the way, we get a reference to the rocket in the title. We get a symbolic phallic doubling of penis, rocket, and penis rocket rainbow. Gravity's rainbow refers to the shape of the V2 rocket's trajectory. It's a rainbow-shaped parabola caused by gravity. So Slothrop in Gravity's Rainbow is questing to find the rocket with serial number 00000. He wants to find out why he's getting these proleptic erections. Why do his moments of arousal seem to be portents of doom and destruction? Over the course of the book, Slothrop becomes increasingly paranoid that he is being monitored and followed. And so we see that he adopts and then sloughs off multiple identities as he makes his way into the zone. This is the post-war occupied wasteland of Central Europe. And he's searching for a mysterious component made from the plastic designed by the man who conditioned him. Though we're meant to question everything in this book, postmodern works give voice to ontological anxiety of being. And so we have this area called the zone in the book, but we think to ourselves, well, is it really just a part of Europe? If not, what is it? What is it supposed to represent? Everything represents something else. And we get to know our protagonist, Tyrone Slothrop. We get to know who he is. But as the book goes on, we cannot help but question what he is. Pynchon gives us this vast canvas which defies typical plot and narrative devices, and this vast canvas feels more like a projection of his mind than a carefully sculptured conventional novel. He gives us this vast canvas, this play area to run through, and we get a space to explore the weightiest themes of the human condition. Really resonant themes with a lot of gravity, and gravity, by the way, can be seen as a metaphor for repression in this novel. Repression of our libidinal desires. But we can also read something of a religious allegory into this novel, because there is a heavy battle between the idea of predestination and free will in this book. And think symbolically in order to make this work. Our questing hero is trying to discover whether his sexual activity, his arousal, presages or predicts or even dictates destruction or not. Or is it random? So we ask ourselves, how is his desire to spread and scatter himself, disperse more of himself? How is that desire linked to the prospect of total destruction? Pynchon gives us the state of humanity in the 20th century and ultimately a search for salvation. And as Maureen Quilligan points out, part of the search for salvation involves locating the cause of potential damnation. Now here's my reading of the text. This is what the novel puts me in mind of. For us humans, it is a knife-edge walk between life and death, between sex and destruction, and the same impulses that drive us to create, to build, to expand, to erect civilizations, those same impulses, if not carefully moderated, threaten to destroy us. The drive that makes young boys want to grow up and work on rockets, like Von Braun, rockets that will take us to the moon and beyond, that drive is taken hostage in adulthood and then is funneled into creating weapons and weapons of complete and utter destruction and chaos that have the potential to wipe out entire civilizations. Everything we've built, or everything someone else has built, now has the potential to be erased from the earth. And then those weapons end up being the foundation for the rockets we wanted to create in the first place. Now, Ernest Becker tells us that the civilizations we create, the rockets we launch, the big weighty tomes that we write, novels like Gravity's Rainbow, all of this is ultimately a grand denial of death. Everything we do is our attempt to flee from our mortality. We are trying to transcend our mortality. We want to secure something of lasting permanence for ourselves. And so, we can see rockets, symbolically, as being a phallic force of destruction and death, and we can see them as being symbolic of expansion, imperialism and colonialism, which is just destruction and death by another name. Now, Time magazine had a really powerful review for Gravity's Rainbow the year it came out that goes like this: Gravity's Rainbow is about man, the symbol-making animal, desperately trying to build a protective system of meaning over his head, while at the same time blind technology increases the odds that something will bash his head in. That's very, very profound. Man, in his pride, makes a Faustian bargain, a deal with the devil when it comes to science and knowledge. Our Promethean questing after fire could be our undoing. And we are also ultimately walking a tightrope of dread, aware of our mortality and desperate for meaning, desperate to discover the hidden connection that binds us together, because if nothing binds us together, we are then in danger of tumbling headlong into the abyss and complete and utter nihilism. Now, it's also a knife-edge walk between nihilism and freedom and liberation, but we erect these systems, we put symbols together, we find patterns, because the prospect that nothing binds us together at all, that is more terrifying than the idea that something is connecting everything. Are we free, or is everything we do determined? That's a question that we're going to want to ponder as we work through Gravity's Rainbow. Now, there's also this idea that we can attain freedom through play. Jean-Paul Sartre said that as soon as man apprehends himself as free and wishes to use his freedom, then his activity is play. Freud told us that the essence of our being is in being faithful to our unconscious, in pursuing the principle of pleasure. Now, we often try to repress our desire to pursue and indulge and attain pleasure, and we end up developing neuroses. And as Norman O. Brown tells us in Life Against Death, a book that's well worth picking up if you want to understand Gravity's Rainbow, as Brown tells us, neurosis is simply original sin. We're all born flawed and conflicted, and we're all born repressed. But what if we could be faithful to our drives and our deepest desires? Indeed, William Blake saw our freedom in the idea of pursuing our delight. Now, why is all of this important? Well, it's important because ultimately Gravity's Rainbow, this novel, is pure play. We might wonder, what is it that causes a great writer like Thomas Pynchon to write this kind of book? What motivates great writers and artists? Do we write these sprawling novels as a denial of death? Is this a way of defeating our mortality? Is this a defiant middle finger to the grave? Or do we write novels because we want to attain freedom through play? Now, the psychoanalytical explanation of art would be to see art as a liberation of repressed libidinal instincts. Because we know we will die, we must play, because in our play we can achieve freedom and we can transcend our mortality. Sigmund Freud would see wit as play. So being funny, making jokes, and there's a lot of wit, there's a lot of comedy, bizarre comedy, grotesque comedy, but there's a lot of free play in Gravity's Rainbow. And Freud defined wit as deriving pleasure from free use of words and ideas, and indeed Freud saw humour as the highest defence function because it openly confronts the most painful ideas in life. Freud, as usual, would also deploy a sexual analogy when talking about wit. He would speak of the build-up to a joke as being like foreplay. And Gravity's Rainbow as a book is like foreplay, intercourse, and a climax. We can see our unconscious desires through our dreams and through neuroses, but neither of these liberates us, whereas art does. Art liberates our unconscious desires, and that's what it feels like. That's why it's so difficult to read Gravity's Rainbow, because it feels like you're wading through a dream, through a nightmare, where things don't quite make sense. Even if you're aware of your dream, you might have a moment, and this is liable to make you wake up, you might have a moment where you think this is all absurd and nothing actually makes sense. That's because the unconscious speaks in signs and symbols. Remember, we're a symbol-making animal. You can intuitively understand your dreams, and you can intuitively understand books like Gravity's Rainbow, but it requires thought on a different level. It requires connecting with our unconscious. And I think that ultimately, because art can liberate us, our freedom lies within the covers of a book like Gravity's Rainbow. When we're reading, yes, it's bizarre, yes, it's confusing, yes, it doesn't deliver its meaning in a straightforward way, but we are free, we are playing, we are giving our unconscious drives free rein to run amok, and we are indulging in mindless pleasures. We are pursuing our delight. And why do we want to spend some time in freedom, in that space, that gap between stimulus and response? Why do we want to read imaginative literature vicariously and get swept up in it? Because ultimately, the threat of mortality looms over us all. We all have a rocket threatening to fall on us over the course of our lives, even if we're not in a war zone. We all have a hand of death that will come down and remove us. And whether we take comfort in that idea from Werner Von Braun that nature doesn't know extinction, it just knows transformation, whether we take comfort in that or not, doesn't stop us pondering, like Hamlet, what dreams may come in that sleep of death once we have shuffled off this mortal coil. That must give us pause. We don't know what's on the other side. We don't know what we're going to confront when we die, not objectively. And that is terrifying. Now, the terrifying thing about the rocket that's looming over all of us is very much like the V2, many of us will not see it coming. We won't know that it's going to come. We will not hear the explosion. And indeed, I had a horrifying moment just the other day as I was rereading through Gravity's Rainbow. I had a horrible flash, a vision of my own mortality, the end of my life, and I had this realization that it would most likely be the experience of nothing. Fade to black. The value of books like Gravity's Rainbow is that these books relieve the burden of being a soul trapped in a body that will die. A body that craves pleasure that will eventually reach a moment when pleasure can be no longer sought. These books relieve the burden of living for a short moment, and that is why they are so intensely valuable. Now, how has Gravity's Rainbow been received? Well, Gravity's Rainbow is very frequently compared with another difficult book from the 20th century, and that is James Joyce's Ulysses. Gravity's Rainbow and Ulysses don't actually have that much in common, aside from both arising out of the fertile soil of the tumultuous 20th century and the fact that they are both astonishingly and daringly experimental. And both of them require the reader to work before the meaning is yielded up. Joyce is in the modernism camp, James Joyce is a modernist, whereas Thomas Pynchon is in the postmodern camp. He's a pesky postmodernist. And there is a huge difference between writers in the first half of the 20th century and the second half. Another commonality between these two books is that their inherent difficulty has resulted in readers falling into one of two camps. One, they are either dismissive. This work is pretentious, it's deliberately difficult, it's unreadable, perhaps it's completely nonsensical and not worth bothering with. That's one reaction, an understandable reaction. Or there's another reaction, and that is love, reverence, obsession. We know that Joycean scholars dedicate their lives to his work, and there has also been a cult of Pynchonians for decades. Indeed, the body of critical writings, both the academic and the more informal online, is lovingly referred to as the Pindustry. I love that. Pynchon developed a cult following from the very early days of his writing career. He had been composing Gravity's Rainbow for around 10 years whilst writing other books. Books like The Crying of Lot 49, which he described as a short story that got away from him. That came out in 1966, and V, his debut novel, had come out in 1963, and he had published some short stories too. Now, we don't know a lot about Thomas Pynchon the man, and he has a reputation for being a recluse, which he says is just code for doesn't like to talk to reporters, which we can understand. But we do know that he wrote Gravity's Rainbow whilst living near Venice Beach, California. He was a Cornell graduate who had served in the Navy and had also worked as a technical copywriter for Boeing in the 60s. And he would get stoned in Venice Beach, and then he would go home and he would write Gravity's Rainbow, composing it by hand on engineer's graph paper. Gravity's Rainbow was published in 1973, and in the first month alone, it sold 45,000 copies. In the first year, it sold over 100,000 copies. Not every writer can clock those numbers. If a writer sells that many copies, then it is a smash hit. They are a success. It means that they had a fervent audience, desperately waiting for their work. And upon publication, Gravity's Rainbow very swiftly became part of university syllabuses and would be taught. Many professors saw the necessity to teach it because it is difficult. If any book needs to be taught or shared and explored in a classroom environment, then this is it. But Gravity's Rainbow was also commercially successful too. And what we have is a book that many readers absolutely adore, and many readers love it because it is difficult, because it is funny, because it is profound. But we also have a book that many readers bought and never read. Most readers will not get past the first few pages. So let's talk about what makes Gravity's Rainbow so difficult. Well, Pynchon's postmodernity is his difficulty. And obviously, postmodernism is defined up against modernism. So we need to know what modernism is and how postmodernism differs from it. Modernism is the writings in the first half of the 20th century. Postmodernism is the second half. We can define it as being from approximately 1960 or thereabouts onwards. Now, Brian Michael has a really great essay called Pynchon's Postmodernism, which catalogues the different markers of the postmodern era and applies them to Pynchon if you're interested. But let's do a very swift rundown of some of those markers together right now. First, let's talk modernism. It's much easier to think of key figures, postmodern writers, yeah? So you probably think of James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound when you think modernism. When you think postmodernism, you probably think David Foster Wallace, Don DeLillo, Cormac McCarthy and Thomas Pynchon. Modernism is concerned with epistemology, theory of knowledge, and artistic techniques in the postmodern era aim to unpick and explore and understand the differences in perspective. For example, the subjective experience of time. That's a very prevalent modern theme and preoccupation. Modern writers want to explore the unreliability of knowledge, how it differs depending on who's viewing the world. Postmodern imaginative literature, however, is concerned with exploring ontology, theory of being. And so the artistic and narrative techniques are used to explore modes of being and the differences between different states of being. Postmodernism explores ideas like fictionality, multiple worlds, and how fictional worlds are created and uncreated and dismantled. So what are some markers of postmodernism? Well, the first really significant and interesting thing is postmodernism collapses the high and the low together. It smashes the high and low cultures right into each other. The great modern writers in the first half of the 20th century sought to self-consciously erect an elitist hedge around their work, and they made their works deliberately difficult for that reason. Postmodernism is exceptionally difficult, but postmodern writers actually want to be part of popular culture. They want to be read. They want their books to enter the mainstream. They'd be very happy for that to happen. And David Foster Wallace is a brilliant example of this. You can look up his interviews. He really did want to be read by people. He wanted to be accessible, but he wanted mainstream readers to endeavour to understand his work and combat his difficulty. So with postmodernism, we often see works that are popular culture, commercially successful, and they're also intensely cognitively challenging and demanding. So I would say that modernism is exclusive and difficult, whereas postmodernism aims to be inclusive and difficult. One way that you can see postmodernism's collapsing of the boundaries between the high and low is through pastiche. You read Pynchon and you will find homages and parodies of comic books, spy novels, 1940s radio shows and movies. And that's the fun. Now, Pynchon demands that readers have a really esoteric, eccentric and varied body of knowledge. In the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we'll be talking about the Kabbalistic elements of Thomas Pynchon. He needs his readers to understand Kabbalah. He also needs his readers to understand tarot. He makes references to really high culture like Wagner. But among all of that, he blends pop culture references. So readers need to have a knowledge of different brands, music, television, films, that sort of thing. And Pynchon's pastiche is filled with irony. There's always a sense that a joke is being had, even if we're not completely sure what the joke is. Another interesting thing about postmodern literature is that it is double-coded. So there are two kinds of readers that writers like Pynchon write for. One, you have a minority of avant-garde readers, and two, you have the wider public, people who just love a good story and a good challenge, not necessarily academics. And this really explains why Gravity's Rainbow is subject of both academic study and enjoys a strong cult following. Another element of postmodern literature, and this is exemplified in Pynchon's work, is the fact that it's very meta. Pynchon writes, and here comes a mouthful, historiographic metafiction that essentially turns a distrusting, questioning eye on the narratives we have long enjoyed. He subverts them, he overturns them, he's suspicious of them. And so postmodernism is very subversive, and postmodernism is also a rather paranoid condition. Again, a word and idea that runs relentlessly through Gravity's Rainbow. If you read this book and you think, my goodness, this feels like I'm having a paranoid episode, that's the postmodern experience much of the time. Where modern writers sought to explore the individual's subjective experience, and typically this is an alienated experience, postmodern writers seek to completely fragment and decenter the individual. And we see that with Slothrop in this book. You need to question everything when you are reading a postmodern work. And you'll see that writers like Pynchon set up strange loops and paradoxes where the boundary between what we take to be the primary world and inset worlds is blurred. What does that mean? It means, for example, you're reading a story and one of the characters gives you a story within a story. Or just say, as is common in Gravity's Rainbow, you get some analepsis, so you get a flashback, or you get a memory, you get thrown back in time. Or, and this is also really common in Gravity's Rainbow, you'll see figurative language deployed, like a metaphor, but then it just runs on and on and on, and it extends so relentlessly that you start to question your reality. Are we living in the world of the metaphor? Has the metaphor become reality? But we can see this with flashbacks most primarily. It's a really disorienting experience because sometimes you're not sure if you're actually reading what you think is the primary narrative or if this is a flashback or a hallucination. That's common too. And the lines between all of these different conditions are so blurred. And truly, without giving anything away, Pynchon will absolutely keep you guessing and questioning until the very end. Now, all of this might sound very daunting, but it is manageable and it is achievable to get through Gravity's Rainbow and enjoy it. I would highly recommend you pick up Gravity's Rainbow, A Companion by Pynchon scholar Stephen C. Weisenberger. This is a really good guide because what you want to do with Gravity's Rainbow is settle in for a long ride. Your first reading is just a cursory reading and you're absolutely not going to exhaust this novel. I do not believe it's possible to get even close to exhausting this novel. You just need to settle in and understand that this is a lifelong journey. So you need a companion, and what you're going to want to do is consult the little synopses that take you through the book in Weisenberger's Companion. And what you'll see is he explains Pynchon's allusions. Pynchon is very allusive. There are so many different references and many of them will go over our heads. Now you don't need to spend an inordinate amount of time on each and every reference. Just focus on the bits that capture your interest, that intrigue you, follow them up a little bit. But you want a guide and you want to consult summaries as you work your way through the book, and you also want to pose questions to other readers. So if you're interested in really breaking this novel open, then we are going to be discussing this together at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We are going to crowdsource meaning together. And this is what Pynchon wanted for readers. He wanted readers to band together. And so what's interesting is this difficulty. Yes, we might fling the book across the room in anger that we can't understand it, or it might bring us closer to other people. And that's a beautiful experience. What I really love about Pynchon is the fact that his difficulty creates community. Now, another thing you want to do, as well as discussing the book and using a companion and consulting lectures like the lectures at the book club, you're also going to want to have a pen in your hand. This is really, really important. If you have a pen poised, you're going to be more attentive, you're going to be focusing more, and just underline liberally, scribble in the margins, pose little questions to yourself, circle things, just make the page muddy with your ink, cover it with your thoughts, because this is active reading. And Pynchon is one of those writers who really demands active reading. Some readers we can settle in and just escape into their world and they'll tell us a story and we don't have to think too much. Pynchon demands his readers to really be awake and alert and attentive. And it doesn't matter if you don't understand, yeah? Firstly, I see confusion and not understanding as merely preface to understanding. Everything that clicked for you in your life at one point you didn't know, and anything that's worth knowing requires effort to know it, any skill, for example, and it is that feeling of revelation where it all clicks. That's a beautiful feeling. So it's actually a really good thing to not understand everything, and it wouldn't be desirable. If you understood everything, then the novel might not be inexhaustible. Whereas if you can barely even scratch the surface on your first, second or third reading, that means you have a companion for life. It's a very rewarding thing to have a book that journeys with you over the course of your life. It's like having a friend, and the community around Pynchon's works are so warm too that it feels like you've got many friends. Now, at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, I'm going to be splitting our discussions into 4 parts to correspond with the 4 parts of the book. So when you get to the end of a part of Gravity's Rainbow, that's a milestone and that's a stop point. Yeah, so you just need to forge on and keep going to that stop point where you can have a little rest, you can have a little pause, a little discussion, and try to digest what you just read. And also use your marginalia, use your underlinings to reread and just quickly skim back over what you've read. This is a very, very big book, yeah? It's around 900 pages, but breaking it down into chunks makes it much easier. Each part is about 200 pages. Our discussions at the Hardcore Literature Book Club are going to come out roughly every 10 days or so. If you're aiming to follow along live, that means a diet of around 20 to 25 pages per day, but I really do want to stress the importance of embracing your own self-pace. I think this is a good pace because it's very much like tearing the band-aid off, and quite frankly, you do just need to clock pages with this book in order to really get into it and get into a rhythm and for it to start to feel somewhat like a normal narrative. That's not really possible, but you will get your groundings and it will become easier to read through this book. You absolutely can get bogged down on single pages, single lines, and you can spend so much time on them. But I think for a first reading in particular, you want to get through the book and then you can spend that time on a reread. Remember, the first read is just our meeting of the characters and our entrance to the world. But follow your own pace. But of course, if you read at a fair trot, 10 pages, 20 pages, 25 pages a day, That means you'll get through the difficult part at the beginning. Like I said, the difficulty is rather front-loaded, the first 50 to 100 pages. So if you read at a good pace, you'll get through that. So I implore you not to be too daunted by Gravity's Rainbow. You absolutely can and absolutely will read it if you want to. And at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, I will be providing a link through the labyrinth. I will also be clarifying my own thoughts, my own response to the book as we go through, and it's going to be very, very exciting to see what readers make of this work. Honestly, this is a fantastic literary mountain to climb, because if you can climb this mountain, you can tackle any mountain, yeah? If you can read Gravity's Rainbow, then nothing is going to be denied you. Everything is open to you. And we've really just barely scratched the surface of Gravity's Rainbow today. This is most certainly a lifelong book, and truly, it's a really beautiful book. You'll find that, yes, Pynchon's prose is dense, it's difficult, it's elusive, it's demanding, it doesn't give you its meaning. You'll find, however, despite all of that, you'll find long stretches of some of the most beautiful prose written in English, astonishing prose that begs to be read aloud. And that's a very good tip. Read Pynchon aloud or listen to him being read aloud, because sound unlocks sense and the meaning will click into place if you read it aloud. You'll find some of the most beautiful passages, and we'll be lingering over those passages together at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. You'll find some really profound, poignant and painful meditations on the weightiest themes of the human condition. And I think you'll find that ultimately this book is incredible fun. Now, I'd like to end by saying a huge thank you for watching, thank you for being here, and please let us know your relationship with Thomas Pynchon and this novel. Are you gearing up for a first reading of Gravity's Rainbow? If so, what are you anticipating? What are you expecting? What are your concerns? What are you looking forward to the most? If this is a reread for you, then let us know what you made of your previous reads and what you're aiming to get out of your reread this time around. Thank you again so much for being here. I really appreciate you, and I hope you have a lovely day. Happy reading, everybody, and bye-bye for now.